The United States Supreme Court has just accepted a massive new Second Amendment case to be heard on the term's next docket. We're talking about Smith & Wesson versus Mexico. You heard me right. There's a lot more firearm manufacturers involved. What are the stakes? Without overstating it, everything. The stakes are everything. The obliteration and wipeout of the manufacturing of not only firearms, but normal capacity magazines. We're talking about the obliteration and wipeout for gun control, taking over everything. Basically, in a nutshell, the potential destruction of the Second Amendment. Yes, I know that's hyperbolic, but I think by the end of this video, you're gonna unfortunately agree with me. Guys, we're talking about Smith & Wesson versus Mexico. We're talking about the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. It will be more interesting, I promise. Stick with me, so let's get into it. So in 2021, Mexico sued 7 firearms manufacturers here in the United States. Among them were Smith & Wesson, which is the namesake of this case, S&W versus Mexico, but also included are Beretta, Colt, Barrett, Glock, Ruger, Century Arms, and a little shop called Interstate Arms. So that's what we're talking about here. What is Mexico alleging? Well, from the Supreme Court website, which you can find linked below, here's kind of a brief summary of the case. The Mexican government has sued leading members of the American firearms industry, seeking to hold them liable for harms inflicted by Mexican drug cartels. According to Mexico, America's firearms companies have engaged in a series of business practices for decades, from selling semi-automatic rifles, huge no-no, right? To making magazines that hold over 10 rounds, to failing to impose various sales restrictions that have created a supply of firearms later smuggled across the border and ultimately used by the cartels to commit crimes. Mexico asks for billions, with a B,
billions and billions
of dollars in damages, enough to obliterate the Second Amendment in the United States, plus extensive injunctive relief. That's code for, by the way, you will accept new gun control, which, as you may have noticed, they're complaining about semi-automatic rifles. So we're talking about effectively an assault weapons ban. And they're also complaining about so-called normal capacity or high capacity magazines. So this is effectively a backdoor at getting in an assault weapons ban with a magazine ban. That's what we're talking about here. You're starting to see where I'm coming from on the, look, this is not histrionic YouTube clickbait. This is actually very real, dangerous threat. So by quick way of background, the district court dismissed this case under a 2005 law called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or the PLCAA. That doesn't really roll off the tongue. The PLCAA, which generally prohibits and bars lawsuits against firearm manufacturers and companies based on the principle that, hey, criminals are misusing their products, therefore we can sue. But when Mexico appealed to the First Circuit reversed that dismissal and held that the PLCAA does not bar this lawsuit because Mexico stated a claim. So in other words, they're saying that Mexico is claiming, they're stating their case, that the defendants, that's the good guys, that's the fire manufacturers, that the defendants' business practices have aided and abetted firearms trafficking by the cartels, and therefore they have proximately harmed the Mexican government. Proximately harmed, in other words, there's a relationship there. There's a real substantive material relationship there. That's what lawyers mean when they break out these closely descended from Latin words like proximately. So fundamentally, this lawsuit boils down to 2 questions. First question, number 1, whether the production and sale of firearms in the United States is the proximate cause of alleged injuries to the Mexican government stemming from violence committed by drug cartels in Mexico. So in English, are firearm manufacturers in the United States responsible for the crimes of drug cartels in Mexico? That's at least in part what number 1's about. Number 2, whether the production and sale of firearms in the United States amounts to aiding and abetting illegal firearms trafficking because firearms companies allegedly know that some of their products are unlawfully trafficked. So this is kind of like the equivalent of saying, look, we should be able to sue Toyota, Honda, GM, Ford, Tesla, you name it, because those companies know that some of their products are going to be used to commit crimes. Crimes like drunk driving, human trafficking, running over people intentionally, whatever else the case may be, those companies know that a certain percentage of their products are going to be misused in a criminal fashion. So therefore, we should just be able to sue them all, right? That's exactly the logic that's going on here. Thanks for joining on this video. Don't forget to hit that like button and be sure to stick to the end where we have our first ever viewer submitted quote of the day. If you want to play along, post up your quotes with the attribution in the comment field below. I will be sure to cite not only the quote, not only the person who you are citing, but also your username. So be sure to throw that out there. We won't be giving people credits and shout outs. Now back to the video. So some of you might be wondering, why do we even have this Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act? A lot of anti-gunners like to complain about it. It is not unique to the firearms industry. We've seen this in other industries as well. If you go back to the Jim Crow South, basically bigoted racists would sue newspapers that would report on what was going on in the 1950s, 1960s, and so forth. So you had these, what was called the Sullivan Law from the Sullivan case, where the U.S. Supreme Court basically served to check the power of corruptive lawsuits that were weaponized from the Jim Crow South to shut down reporting on what was going on. So we already have this with newspapers. We already have this with the First Amendment, with media and so forth. So how did we get here with the Second Amendment? So in the 1990s, and this is important because you need to know this, this is not only part of our past, but it is part of our present, and trust me, it will happen again. So in the 1990s, there was a tidal wave of coordinated lawsuits against the firearms industry brought by a conglomeration of states, as well as different levels of local and municipal government. Right from the very start, these lawsuits were designed to strike and destroy the firearms industry. Remember, if you have no guns to buy, what good is the Second Amendment? Well, these lawsuits were filed in as many jurisdictions across the United States as possible. They were also highly designed to resist what we would call consolidation, which is where a defendant who's maybe facing a lot of different similar lawsuits across the United States, in order to basically keep their legal cost in check, they kind of consolidate. They want to squish them together into one big lawsuit. Well, these cases were specifically designed with the intention of resisting that. Why? Because the whole purpose of this was not necessarily to win the lawsuits. The whole purpose of this was to weaponize the fact that defending against the lawsuits, by some estimates, would cost firearms companies almost $1 million per day. While on the other side, you had tax dollars being used against them. So tax dollars versus corporate dollars. Who do you think is going to win that war of attrition? If you said tax dollars, congratulations, give yourself a cookie, you got that one right. And they knew this going in. They didn't have to win a single battle. They did not have to win a single lawsuit in order to win the war. They just had to keep the attrition going. As one of the lawyers on the gun control side, John Cole, noted when describing this, he said that they were seeking a, quote, critical mass where the costs alone in defending these lawsuits are going to eat up the gun companies, end quote. And for those of you who may not know, this actually started working. At least 3 firearm companies went out of business, including one, Davis Industries, that was one of the 10 largest manufacturers of handguns in the United States at the time. Do you think it was any real coincidence that Colt Manufacturing stopped producing handguns at about the same time? I don't think so. Do you think it had something to do with the fact that they were, quote, facing 28 lawsuits from cities and counties hoping to punish gun makers? The company could no longer get loans to finance manufacturing because of the lawsuits could be worth $0 or $1 trillion against them, end quote. So in other words, they could keep going on like nothing happened, or they could demolish the value of the company. If you're a bank, if you're a creditor, are you going to be extending credit to a company like that who may not be here in a year or 2 years or 5 years to pay back the loans? You can see how this started to work. Now, I'm not doing a deep dive on this. I've already gone into this in much more detail in another video. I'm just kind of hitting some of the high points here. But back at the time, Smith & Wesson actually agreed in an effort to stop the lawsuits, in an effort to keep manufacturing guns, to allow anti-gunners to run the company and to take over the corporate board. Do you see how this is working? And by the way, while that was happening, another company was wavering at the time. Then New York Attorney General Eliot Spitzer, remember him, He warned a Glock executive, quote, "If you do not sign, your bankruptcy lawyers will be knocking at your door," end quote. HUD Secretary Andrew Cuomo was also quoted as saying that gun manufacturers who did not fall in line would suffer a death by 1,000 cuts in the next round of legal attacks, because it wasn't just one round. It's round after round after round. It's limitless tax dollars. In January of 2005, New York City, ever the friend of civil rights and the Second Amendment, passed a law allowing lawsuits against gun manufacturers and dealers that did not voluntarily implement certain gun control measures. So if you don't play by our rules, which keep in mind that goalpost will keep changing as it always has, then we will be able to sue you out of existence. Now you understand why I'm saying this is so incredibly important. This is backdoor gun control. This is backdoor firearm and accessory extinction of the Second Amendment. That's the reason why we have the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which, by the way, does have carve-outs if you have manufacturers and distributors who are acting in bad faith, who are being complicit with certain things. But of course, there's always someone who's willing to push it. And why not? After all, if they're using government tax dollars to do this, then hey, what do they really have to lose? For those of you who are curious, there have already been a number of constitutional checks on this. As of a couple of years ago, I think I counted that there were 6 courts across the federal, state, and appellate judiciaries that have found the law to be constitutional. There's been 1 jury trial, actually in my home state of Wisconsin. Let me know if you want me to go into more about that. That basically said it did not apply. But make no mistake, if Mexico wins this, this is not a victory for Mexico. This is a loss for the Second Amendment. That's what this is. We appreciate you sticking around, and we are going to be going to our first viewer-submitted quote of the day. Here's a quote from the New Testament. This one is submitted by Super Noble 62. We appreciate you participating. Quote, "If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one." Luke 23:36, quoting Jesus. If you want to see your name up here, if you want to see your quote up here, be sure to post it down in the comment section down below. We're going to start taking some user submissions. And actually, we have a whole list that Derek has sent me. So I was just pulling from that list. That was a good one and one that I've commented on before. We appreciate you sticking around to the end. Don't forget to hit that like button, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please feel free to check out some of our other great content, and we'll see you in the next one.